Excellent. Oh, that's bright. Okay. So welcome everyone. including our online audience. I believe there are quite a few of you out there today. I'm Isabel Story. I'm your presenter for today for the People's Park, the history of Belair National Park, from dubious dealings to happy holiday makers. First of all, I want to start by acknowledging that the Adelaide region is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and we pay respect to their spiritual relationship with their country. The Kaurna people remain custodians of the Adelaide region, and their cultural and heritage beliefs are as important to the living Kaurna people today as to their ancestors. We also pay respect to those Aboriginal people visiting, living or working in the region who come from other areas. And in particular, as we're looking today at the history of Belair National Park, I want to acknowledge not only the Kaurna people, but also the Paramount people who once occupied and moved across what we now call the Adelaide Hills. So today's presentation covers only the history of the National Park from British colonisation through to the mid-1930s. It is important to recognise that for tens of thousands of years, the land, the water and the skies, and all they contained, were of deep cultural and spiritual significance to the Indigenous people who were in and of the land long, long before white settlement. So this image was taken in 1985. It shows an area which was known as the Government Farm from July 1840 until 1891, when the land became South Australia's first and Australia's second national park at Belair. Now, who are we looking at here? On the left, Rear Admiral Sir John Hindmarsh. He was a naval officer and Governor of South Australia. Hindmarsh got himself into a world of strife, made numerous enemies in South Australia, and went off back to England to clear his name. He'd been governor for little over a year. But in that time, in 1838, the colonial government gave squatters' rights to a man named Nicholas Foote to occupy what is now the National Park. Now, the area wasn't fully surveyed at this point. Foote had brought with him cattle, sheep and goats, and he'd also brought with him a prefabricated wooden manning house. So he obtained squatters' rights, he put up his wooden manning house, he fenced paddocks, dug a well and made lots of other improvements to the land. It cost him around £600. Now this is back in the around 1838-39. So that was a lot of money to spend, given that he only had squatters' rights. His likely intention was to purchase the land as soon as it went up for sale. But it was a very expensive gamble. He could be thrown off this prime agricultural land at any time, and so he was in July 1840. And he was thrown off by the man on the right there, Governor George Gawler, who arrived on October the 12th, 1838. Now, there were many difficulties in South Australia at that time, and Gawler spent a large amount of both his own fortune and government funds in making necessary improvements to the colony, including a police force and promoting rural settlement. On the 22nd of July, 1840, Governor Gawler decided to set up the government farm. Now, it was to provide hay feed and agistment for the Survey, Immigration and Stores Department of the government, and these included horses and bullocks used in survey and clearing work. Foote protested, but he was thrown off the land, and having spent his $600, he was given only £300 in compensation, so half of what he'd spent. However, the land acquisition of the government farm was dubious from the very start. A tender for 10 surveyed sections, each of 80 acres, so we're talking 800 acres, was placed by the acting colonial treasurer, George Hall. Now, I'll just have to make sure what page I'm on. On top of that, 3 additional sections were reserved and another 1,000 unsurveyed acres was added. On top of that, the first 800 acres was paid for with a promissory note. So this is the government putting out a promissory note. However, the legal requirement was for all transfer of land to be done in cash. So the promissory note was not valid. It was rectified a couple of years later, I need to point that out. But at the time, the other thing was that the land wasn't put out to tender. That was also a legal requirement. So it was meant to go out for public tender, people paid cash, and that was their land. That is clearly not what happened in this instance. So the government farm went ahead despite this, but the purchase was legally problematic and it had later consequences. Governor Grey was recalled in May 1841, in large part due to overspending and problems which in hindsight were probably not all of his own making. And he was replaced by this man. It was Sir George Grey. He was the third governor of South Australia from 1841 to 1845. Sir George's career included several other colonial posts as governor in New Zealand and South Africa. He later became Premier of New Zealand, and he was also a soldier, explorer and writer, and he had a keen interest in things Indigenous. Governor Grey arrived in May 1841, and when he got here, he found there was only £713 in government funds in the Treasury and mounting debts. So he immediately set out to rectify the situation by selling off anything that wasn't nailed down. That included livestock, government farmland, and anything on the land that he could pull up and sell. He announced that the farm was by no means a necessary appendage to the province, and he proposed a public auction for the 19th of July. And the advertisement, the advertisement offered this splendid farm containing about 1,500 acres of the richest land in the province as an unlimited run for sheep and cattle. However, the sale was cancelled very soon afterwards, and it's probable that this was because the questionable circumstances of the land acquisition had now become public knowledge, and given the fate of Grey's two predecessors, he would likely have wanted to have avoided a public outcry over the government's right to sell the land that it may not actually have owned. So the government farm remained undivided and continued to make hay while the sun shone. And that's a tracing of a map on ink. There's no scale, but it shows essentially the Belair area. These are in hundreds. The Belair area with Sleeps Hill and Government Farm shown at the south end of the 100 of Adelaide. And there it is in more detail. And that's a close-up. That's the area on the left which became the government farm. And in comparison to the right, although differently orientated, is a recent map of Belair National Park. And you can actually see, if you kind of skew it a little bit, that it's the same area of land. Okay. On the left, John McLaren, he's seen here in later years. In his earlier years, he was the first superintendent of Government Farm. Dean Cords, who wrote the 1983 book, The Park at Belair, wonderful reference if you want to know about the park up until about 1940, the park at Belair, referred to McLaren as the first park ranger long before the land became a park. While he was working there, McLaren enclosed about 1,000 acres by post and rail fence, and that was by December 1840. It cost the government about £577, and on top of that, there were the existing improvements that had been made by Nicholas Foote that included the house, the well, the stockyard and the outbuildings. I just want to mention that even though Foote was thrown off the land, he went off to Angaston, grew vineyards and quite a significant family, and then went off to Victoria where he became member for Geelong, and he stayed member of Geelong in Parliament for quite a long time, so he ended up okay. In the centre is John Horsnell, pictured here in 1862. In 1841, John Horsnell was employed at the government farm at Belair, And he also did quite well. In 1842, he went on to acquire the property of Woodvale. In 1844, he became gardener to Dr. Penfold, and of Penfold Wines fame, and planted vines. And in 1856, he stopped working for Dr. Penfold and lived off of rents that he received as a landowner for the rest of his life. On the right, William Cook. Now, he was appointed Keeper of the Government Farm in 1874. He was there to supervise all the adjusted stock for the government, to liaise with timber cutters and wattle bark strippers and fencing contractors. There was a government garden and orchard set up in 1840s, but it was decimated by a huge bushfire in 1877, as was much of the timber on the land. So licences were then granted to take away tons of dead timber and replace miles of dead fencing. This is an 1885 photo of Old Government House, Belair, taken by Manuel Spiller, and it's part of the State Library's National Park collection, which is well worth a look if you want to browse and look at more images than I can show you today. The Government House Cottage, as it was originally called, was built for Governor Richard MacDonald. He was there from 1855 to 1862, and that was at a time when the colony's fortunes had improved. The building was designed by colonial architect Edward Hamilton in 1858. It was completed in 1860, and it was considered a state-of-the-art holiday retreat used by early colonial governors and later visiting British royalty. And although it was surrounded by natural bushland, it came with a Victorian cottage garden. There was a separate servants' quarters and a coach house. Oh, and did I mention that it contained the colony's first indoor plunge pool? Governor Richard MacDonald and his successor, Dominic Daly, regularly used the cottage from about 1860 to 1868. And during Governor Daly's tenure, the cottage, and it was a cottage, it was quite small, about 3 rooms, the cottage was referred to as the Governor's country villa. But by the time of the next governor, John Ferguson, had arrived, the residence had become dank and fetid. There was a constantly flooded cellar, perpetually damp bathroom, and plumbing that wouldn't drain away the effluent. These were the constant complaints of Major John Adam Ferguson, who lived there with his new bride and was both brother and private secretary to the Governor, John Ferguson. Both the Fergusons departed South Australia in 1874, still complaining about the plumbing and how much it would cost to fix to be good enough for a gubernatorial residence. And in the end, Marble Hill was built instead for the Governor's summer residence. And there's the pretty picture of it done in 1834. It's a watercolour, I'm sorry. Anyway, the building survived and it now has heritage listing. It's been restored and it's now furnished as a period Victorian residence, and I believe it's still open to visitors. This watercolour was painted by Annie Jane Duncan in 1934, and at that time the building was still occupied, but this time by the Governor in charge of the National Park Nursery, which many of you would know of or may have visited. Now, there we go again. Non-native animals were imported very early into the colony as domestic animals, or in some cases for hunting. Foxes and rabbits were and remain pests, as are feral cats, dogs, goats, camels, horses, in other parts of Australia. This is a close-up of the old Government House quarters, servants' quarters. And it was set up in 1879. Anyone know what for? Rabbits, yep, exactly. Well done. Top of the class. Okay, so what it was a factory to manufacture highly toxic carbon bisulfide for killing rabbits, which were a massive, massive pest. Sulphur came by train from Port Adelaide. By then, the train line was developing. Sulphur came by train from Port Adelaide, and the poison was then exported in barrels by train back down again, mostly for use by South Australian landowners. Some was exported to other colonies. Production was discontinued in 1885 when they discovered that some equipment was beyond repair, but they had a huge stock of it. So that was all right. Lots more poison to put out to kill the rabbits. Anyway, the buildings were handed over to the newly created Woods and Forest Department for a government nursery, still a nursery, where the government house gardens had been, and the buildings became home, as I mentioned, to the nursery curators in mid-1886. As the area opened up, an increasing number of farmers and visitors made the trip up from the Adelaide Plains to the hills. Now, a little bit lost. Just going to, that's a view from the top of the hill. You can just see the cart and horse there. And there we are. That's the viaduct carrying a locomotive near Sleeps Hill. The extension to Nairn enabled the later route through to Melbourne. This is a sketch in Frearson's Weekly from 6th of November of a railway camp. This is 1880. And it's what happened was that there was... This is the report, also in Frearson's Weekly. Things became fraught from time to time in the railway workers' settlements. There were 3 camps, tent camps, and they were referred to as the 15-mile, 16-mile and 17-mile camps. And this is a report of a killing after a drunken brawl over religion between an Irish Catholic and a Protestant Orangeman. The Protestant stabbed the Catholic and he died the following morning, and then the Protestant, of course, was taken off and held for murder. From time to time, the Surveyor General of the colony reminded the keeper of the farm, William Cook, whom we saw earlier, to keep a watch out for, and I quote, interlopers causing inconveniences. And the Surveyor General sent this reminder out on several occasions. By inconveniences, he meant poaching and hunting, all sorts of, and brawling, of course. And it was all put down to the railway navvies camped in and near the government farm in those 3 camps. When the navvies weren't working, they had nothing much to do, and there was no access to pubs, but sly grog was smuggled in, and it was hidden in barrels in rock crevices throughout the park. We also think bottles were hidden in stone walls and possibly in chimneys, which oddly enough were constructed within the tents to keep out the cold. So there was definitely a lot of booze around, and very, I guess, work-sore navvies at the end of the day, and gangers made good use of that grog with sometimes tragic consequences, as we've just seen. This is a sketch plan of government farm divided into blocks for sales of dead timber. It was compiled in the Surveyor General's office, and it's a photolithograph with manuscript editions in ink and colour. In the 1860s, a former vegetable garden near the governor's cottage was planted out with species of several English and European trees, and this was partly to give the vice-regal residents a pleasant outlook, but also to experiment with the acclimatisation of non-native trees. So officially that area was named the Government Garden, and it's shown on early plans also as the Belair Experimental Orchard. I didn't locate any of those plans, but this map showing the area surrounding Government House, including creeks, ridges, gullies, roads, lists the name of trees, but you have to go in pretty close to see it. Now, this is Samuel Dixon. By 1881, orchards and berry farms had been successfully set up on the lands surrounding and bordering the government farm. So in 1818, the government once again, 1880, I've got my numbers in reverse. In 1881, the government once again proposed selling the farm by subdivision. By 1883, the train line had opened up the area to travellers. And as the 80s progressed, so did the threat and the promise. So Walter Gooch of Belair and James Page of Mitcham were very vocal in saving the area, and they worked with Samuel Dixon, pictured there, and a young journalist named Arthur F. Robin. There is no extant photograph of him as far as we know. Arthur Robin, like Dixon, was a staunch conservationist, and they worked with the field naturalists and other scientific bodies. And it was Arthur Robin who set up a private members' bill to hold all of the government farm in trust as a national park. Dixon went on to become one of the original members of the National Parks Board of Commissioners and a member of the field naturalists responsible for the tree planting committee at Belair at the National Park. He also instigated the exchange of seeds between Australian colonies and with other countries, using the local flora in a two-way exchange. And he believed in the value of conserving endemic species. And after it became a national park, he managed to secure the eastern part of the land as a refuge for native flora. Dixon resigned from the board in 1905. This is Walter Gooch. The image on the left shows him around the time he began the fight in a public recreation park at Belair. And on the right, you can see that he was the father of the splendid national park. So that was after it was won, of course. And it was quite a fight. It was 10 years to get the government farm turned into an actual park for the people. In December 1881, Dixon was very perturbed by this idea of the land breaking up, and as were other people. And so in December 1881, he had this bright idea, and he led a picnic group of leading citizens to the farm. As a result, in early January, so within a couple of weeks, a memorial, that's a petition, was signed by 312 prominent gentlemen, was presented to the Commissioner of Crown Lands, and it requested that the land of government farm be kept in public hands as an experimental farm, or a forest, or a water reserve, or even a zoological garden. But the favourite proposal was for a recreational park for the people. And Gooch began to work with Dixon, James Page and Arthur Robin over time, and many others, urging the government to establish a public park on the land. The Trades and Labour Council and the United Friendly Societies became involved, as did some of the newspapers. There were, however, major differences between Gooch and Dixon. Gooch and his allies favoured a recreation park, and Dixon, with his Field Naturalist Association background, emphasised the environmental aspects of land preservation. However, at a Field Naturalist meeting in August of 1888, Arthur F. Robin and Samuel Dixon proposed the declaration of Belair National Park. It took another 2 years, but in 1890, the colony government approved this, but the park bill was ruled out of order by the Legislative Council in November 1890. So it was backwards, forwards. 2 weeks later, Walter Gooch hosted yet another VIP picnic at the farm, and this led to the Commissioner of a deputation going to the Commissioner of Crown Lands. And finally, on the 19th of December 1891, the National Park Act was passed by South Australia's Parliament and received the Governor's assent in January 1892. So the people finally had their park, at last, hooray. So those are the historical beginnings of the National Park at Belair. I'm now going to take a quick chronological journey through what happened in the People's Glorious Park, as one newspaper dubbed it, and time permitting, we may reach the 1930s. So let's see how we go. Okay, so this is a picnic held by the Broys Brigade at Belair National Park on November the 11th, 1893. And This one is a single image taken from a stereo glass plate image of photography students at Belair. Stereo photography was where you would have had two almost identical images, and then you looked through a little viewer and they became that one image. So that's actually a stereoscopic glass plate image. This is a view with a girl standing by a well in the national park, and this would have been about 1900. They did have facilities in the park for boiling water. They had wells. They had at one stage you could buy water, boiled water from the kiosk that was set up. All of this, a lot of the facilities in the park, or all of the facilities in fact, were out for hire, and we'll see a little bit about that in a moment, because that was the only way the park could pay its staff for maintenance. There was a very small government grant which disappeared during the Depression, during the 1930s Depression, so the park was very much on its own. But certainly at this stage they raised funds any way they could, and that was also by sale of timber and by sale of by the sale of wattle bark, as I mentioned earlier. So this is a group, excuse me. This is a group portrait of the 1902 National Park Commissioners, quite well-dressed gentlemen arranged in 3 tiers, all looking in different directions. That was very fashionable in photography at that time. So from left to right, the top row, John Murray on the left in the top. Next to him, Alfred Corker Minchin and Morris Voldemar Holzer. In the second row, W.H. Sanders, who was the curator, Lawrence O'Loughlin, Sir Edwin T. Smith, and Walter Gooch, and Sir Lewis Cohen, who was one time Mayor of Adelaide. And sitting, Walter Gill on the left, and on the other side, Samuel Dixon. So they were the movers and shakers of the park. Sanders, W.H. Sanders, was there for quite a long time. He was I'll talk about him in a moment, I think. Okay, so this is a 1900 notice to the caterers, picnic parties and others advertising park facilities for hire, and note the signature of the curator, W.H. Sanders, 22nd of August 1900. In about 1912, he drowned quite tragically in the railway dam at Belair. The newspapers were fairly circumspect, I guess, in terms of what led to his death. But all of the reports that I read said that he was very anxious about his position, very determined to make the park work, and under a lot of stress and a lot of worry. The odd thing about it is that Cordes and one of the newspaper reports I read indicated that anecdotally, and one newspaper report, that his body was found after a few days' absence. He was last seen about 3 o'clock in the morning, disappeared. The body turned up a few days later in the railway dam. But some of those reports, and anecdotally, said that his body had a rope around the waist, and one report said that his hands were behind his back. Now, I was speaking to some colleagues trying to work out how you could get your hands, even a rope around your waist and your hands bound in, let alone with your hands behind your back with a rope around your waist. And he had been having problems on an ongoing basis with some of his employees who had gone to such lengths as writing to the Advertiser and disparaging him and his leadership, and also going to the lengths of using false names and identities, even with wrong names, wrong addresses. And that had gone on for quite some time. So nobody will ever, I suppose, really know what happened that night, but it was a very, very tragic end to a very hard worker. Okay, so on a more cheerful note, it's better. Okay, so let's, in terms of the hiring of the facilities, let's have a look at some of the possible hirers. These are photographs of W. Men's and Company. Men's used to, a lot of the large employers used to have a day. They'd give their employees a day off and they'd all trundle off to Belair, sometimes by drag, that's big coach, and sometimes by train, often by train as the line expanded, and also they would go up themselves by pony and in smaller vehicles. I think I've just thrown it away. Yes. Okay, so this is a horse-drawn coach on the left, travelling up Belair Road, and on the right there's a postcard of Long Gully National Park. This is about 1900. 1900 to 1910 was a really big era for postcards, and you see them for all sorts of scenic events and scenic places. There's another picnic, National Park, 1903. And here, by 1903, you have the first run of the Automobile Club. They were formed on the 30th of September 1903, and their very first event was held on Saturday the 31st of October of that year. Sir Tom Barr-Smith was president and Vivian Lewis was one of the vice presidents, and the group assembled on North Terrace, just down the road opposite the museum. Well, actually it would have been here, so just over there, and travelled to Belair. Now, there were restrictions on cars in the car park, including an 8 mile per hour speed limit. I think that's probably the same speed limit as we have in the car park over the road, but I'm not quite sure about that. Anyway, there were restrictions on cars in the park, and there was a report that motor cars were charging fees for a grocer's picnic in 1905. And that was, I believe, the Grocers' Picnic of 1904. So the board of the park management decided to disallow motor cars for hire or for charging fees in the park, at least for a time. Okay. Oh, sorry, that's the Grocers' Picnic. As I mentioned, postcards were very, very popular in the era. This is about 1905, and it's a colour postcard of Belair National Park showing a road leading towards a building with the trees and park on the other side with a couple of horses. No, I can't see the horses in that one. Oh, yes, right down on the very far front left. You can just see the backs of a couple of horses on the far left. This is the Shade House at Belair. It looks very, very tranquil, but I have to mention that there were downsides, and those downsides included noise, particularly from umpire bands and brass bands, a lot of drunkenness, and to the point that the park had its own constables who didn't have a uniform, but they had badges, and they had the power to lock up the rowdy miscreants. The park had its own lockup. In fact, it had 2 lockups, one larger than the other, Dean Cords records that park staff would creep up unseen and drain the kegs to prevent further intoxication. Hopefully none of them ever got caught by the picnickers. This is a poster for a Christmas taxation cricket match to be played at the National Park Belair on the 17th of December 1910. And this one is the Register newspaper. They took their staff picnic group up there on the 19th of March 1910, and that's Long Gully Pavilion National Park. The Argyll hire car A18, which I think is the one on the left there, was operated by FR Moore of Semaphore. So by then you certainly could take a hire car up into the park, but you couldn't operate them. As far as I know, you couldn't charge within the park, but you could charge to go up and go back, of course. Horse-drawn carriages in the Adelaide Hills weren't, however, immediately replaced by the motor car or the motor bus or charabanc, as it was called. And here's a group of ornithologists, as in bird watchers, on a picnic outing at Mount Lofty. Poor horse. There are stories of, particularly, someone was telling me a story about this one. You can see the picnickers, the travellers, walking up that path on the left, and what would happen was that it would be too hard for the horses to get up. So many of them, the more public spirited, I think, would get out and they'd walk up that path to the top, and then the drags would pick them up at the top and continue the journey. Poor horses. Okay. 1910, a group of hungry picnickers at Belair National Park. They used to wear their Sunday best, even on the Saturdays, in the early days of going up to the park. I never worked out why they did that, although white, of course, is much lighter to wear and more comfortable, I would guess, in a white dress than you would be in a dark one. Okay, that's what I meant about stereoscopic images. So the camera would have two lenses, it would take the two images, and then when the viewer looked at them, they would form one. And that is an image of wood carting here. The sale of wood, as I mentioned, like wattle bark and the facilities hire, were all revenue streams. And this is the Brighton Tennis Club enjoying a picnic in the park. The first two grass tennis courts appeared quite soon after the park opened. So park opened 1891 and they were available from January 1895. Later courts followed, although these were clay surfaced, and by 1908 there were 21 courts. Tennis was very, very big in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So sport was allowed, but originally not on Sundays. The park rules were very egalitarian though, and on at least one occasion, preaching within the park was also banned. That was good. Okay. So there we have a finish of a race for young girls at National Park. Often these were parts of church picnics. This is a friendly society picnic march, and you can see men, women and children marching with the Ancient Order of Foresters banners. This is just prior to their arrival at the National Park. And as I mentioned, the friendly societies all got behind the building of the setting up of the park for the people. Shown here are a group of firefighters taking a rest after controlling a fire in the park. This is 1916. Fires were prevalent at the time, and rumour had it that this was related to the fact that kegs of beer were rolled out as rest break refreshments for the hard-working firefighters. Interestingly, when authorities decided to stop providing beer, the number of fires decreased considerably. That is fact. Now, what are we looking at here? The caption on the back of this photograph reads Belair National Park 1915. Edith May Osborne on the left, and in the centre, TGB, that's Professor T.G. or Bentley Osborne. On the right, there they are again. They were married. So field botanists. And Edith May Osborne, I had not come across her before, but she was a Master of Science, and she was on the Board of Governors of the Adelaide Botanic Garden from 1915 to 1927. May Osborne was also the first professional botanist woman to be appointed to the board, and she was only 24 years old when that happened, so she was quite something and quite a find. Very glad to see her. Okay, So on the left, we have a photograph just titled Gathering Wildflowers. Now, wildflowers and ferns particularly were in demand, and travellers would go up. Now, you imagine hundreds of people in the park on one day, all gathering huge bundles of ferns and flowers. There was one report in a paper in social news about how the bride's friends had all gone up into the hills to gather ferns and flowers to decorate the reception, which is all very well, but when you've got hundreds of people doing it, that becomes a major problem. So from time to time, there were attempts to stop it. There were even threats to prosecute a group of Adelaide High School girls who were caught doing it on one occasion. So on the right there is a field naturalist report. A party of members of the field naturalist section of the Royal Society of South Australia travelled to the National Park on Saturday under the leadership of Mrs. R.S. Rogers. The party was successful in finding specimens of winter-flowering orchids, particularly greenhoods. I won't go through all of them. And the Grevilla, now I'm having problems with this, the Grevilla lavandulaceae. Someone correct me on that? Delaceae. That makes more sense because it's a little plant and looks like that, but it's not huge. It's a little shrub, I believe, low flowering plant. Okay. In 1919, a new railway tunnel, one of a number, was completed at Sleeps Hill in South Australia, and I've included it because apart from its historical significance, I wanted to show you part of South Australia's built heritage within the park. That's quite apart from the various cottages and the ovals and the kiosks and so forth. And what I wanted to show you in particular are the conditions under which the construction workers worked. You can barely make them out. There's just a little light point on the left beyond that white heap of rubble. You can see there are two tracks, and just to the left you can see a little glimmer of light that I think is the end of the tunnel, and there are two men sitting on the left in the tunnel. They worked with hand tools and picks and shovels for the most part, burrowing through rock and essentially breathing in dirt, and I just wanted to remind us all that they were there. So back to the fresh air. These are visitors arriving outside the kiosk building at Long Gully, Belair National Park, and these are sailors from HMS Renown, and that was a ship that brought the Prince of Wales to South Australia on his visit in July 1920, and also sailors from the HMAS Australia. 3 uniformed soldiers are sitting with them, and you can see the inevitable bottles of West End bitter are prominently displayed at the front, and there's a soldier with a young woman right at the back of the photograph as well, near the tree. This is again a large firm picnic organised by the machinery firm, we think, Clutterbuck Brothers, who were in Hindley Street. And you'll note the musicians with the brass instruments and the drums sitting in the front row. So 30 years after the first noise complaints, they were still at it. I'm not sure. I mean, it may have been fine for those who liked brass bands, or maybe they had earplugs, I don't know. So in 1922, they were still enjoying sports. And here we see another massive group, this time with the charabanc from the, like the register, from the Cheney Motor Company of Weymouth Street. And here, this is this sparkling thing filled with very smartly dressed passengers is the Tourist Bureau motor coach, which was published in 1926. However, the new craze of motoring also brought with it the risk of accidents. And there's one. I believe no one was hurt in that one. But despite the hazards, the park was well worth the journey. And here we see visitors walking through the national park with cherry blossom in bloom. Now, I can end it there for those of you who have to leave, at 12:45. For those of you who want to stay, I have a few more slides and I can take you through those. So feel free to leave if you need to. Otherwise, I'll continue on for about another probably 8 minutes. Okay, so what do we see here? These are scouts who were gathered at the Belair National Park on the 26th of December 1936 to the 4th of January 1937, and it was an event to mark the 1936 centenary of South Australia, in which there were hundreds and hundreds of major events. The gathering was highly successful, had over 4,000 participants. However, there was a tragic incident on the Saturday evening, and shown here are park rangers, also scout leaders, Richard Coombe and Natalie Gregory in 1989. And according to the accompanying Messenger newspaper report, they're standing by a stone circle recreated to commemorate a death. A young man, according to the report, fell from a tree, a scout, a patrol leader actually. That tree is shown in the background of this photograph. But here we see Richard and Natalie again in the stone circle. They're holding a map or a diagram that led them to the exact spot. Now, at the time of the death, the park committee was asked, could they put up a plaque? And they refused. So instead, the scouts put up a circle of stones for him, and then over time that was lost. So this was a recreation and a finding of the exact spot. His name, he was 17 years old, he was a New South Wales Scout Patrol leader, and his name was William Birchnell. And the report says he accidentally fell out of a tree, but that is not what happened. A number of news reports were published in the first week of January 1937, and all of them reported that one of William's, all of them reported that one of William's Scout Patrol had swung a rope and a stone over a tree branch so the patrol could swing from it, a sort of Tarzan style, I guess. And as William did so, his feet still on the ground, a branch fell, so he was moving forward and the branch fell and he went straight into it, hitting him in the chest, and death was almost instantaneous. So that's what actually happened. In the 1980s, I must point out that Trove newspapers didn't exist in the form it does now. So fact-checking decades-old news stories would have been very difficult. And just to plug, Trove has been an enormous boon to researchers, but with the caveat, don't believe everything you read in the newspapers and always look for other sources. So just a reminder for the researchers amongst you. And that's one of the 1930s reports. So most of us are aware that there are native fauna in the park, the koalas, the wallabies, the echidnas, the frogs. But I'd like to take a moment just before I end today's program to recall the domesticated animals in the national park. So there were horses, there were bullocks, there were cows, sheep, working and pet dogs, and they were there from the very early days of white settlement. At various times they played a part in the workings of the government farm, of course, and later the national park, especially the park. Horned animals were banned fairly early on, but horses and sheep were useful and profitable, so they stayed for longer. Horses, of course, were used for carting heavy materials and heavy passengers, as we've seen, and land clearing. This 1905 image of the shade house, it's a postcard in the Belair National Park, shows several horses grazing near the building. This is a bullock team and driver working in the park. It was taken by Jack Wilson. He was an amateur photographer on holidays and just snapped this shot in the park in 1935. This one shows sheep in the hill paddock of Witunga Farm. It's a flock of sheep, some recently shorn in the hill paddock, and the orchards south of Adelaide and the Melbourne railway line are in the background. Now we know that the National Park kept sheep because the purchases appear in the records, as does the certificate of registration of a sheep brand, and that was a sheep brand for the sheep belonging to the National Park in 1933. Here's a mid-1930s postcard of Long Gully. This is a 1937 view of the railway tracks and platforms at Belair Station. There was a station also at Long Gully, of course. So you can see a train approaching from the east and several people waiting on the platform. This later image shows visitors getting off the train at Belair railway station, and you can see they're carrying picnic blankets and tennis rackets all ready for the day. And here's an earlier view of Long Gully from a different vantage point. And this final image is courtesy of South Australia Parks and Wildlife, and it shows the RSL walk at one of many walks at Belair National Park. I also need to mention that Belair National Park was declared a State Heritage Area on the 19th of September 1985, and I can highly recommend a visit. It's on my list of places to go in the next month again. So thank you for your attendance, folks. Are there any questions? No? Oh, one?